You're watching a lesson on group policy. Now, speaking of group policy, I need to tell you something here. There's a lot of information to cover when it comes to group policy. So what I've done is I've broken apart this information into 3 different lessons. The first of which we're going to talk about right now, which is just a basic introduction to group policy. And in this introduction, we're going to mostly just kind of go through the basic logistics and makeup of working with something called group policy objects. Okay, so let's go ahead and just jump right in and see how group policy objects work. Okay, so to get things started, here we happen to be on NYDC1. Okay, so this is our main domain controller that we created for the globalmantics.local domain. And because it is a domain controller, it's going to automatically have the group policy management tools built into it. Now, we could remotely manage group policy from any other Windows Server 2012 computer or Windows 8 client that had the management tools installed, but we already have them installed here on New York DC1, so we're going to use this computer. Now, speaking of the group policy management tools, I'm going to go ahead and hit the Start button on my keyboard. It takes me into the Start screen, and you'll see right up the top here is Group Policy Management. So if I go ahead and click on that, it takes me into the Group Policy Management utility. Now, in this utility, let's take a look at this. Okay, and I just want to kind of remind you here that this is going to kind of come in pieces. There's a lot to group policy, and so what we're going to focus on here is just the actual logistics of looking at these group policy objects and creating them and things like that. And it's very important that you follow up and watch, if you haven't already, because you may not be watching these in the same order, that you watch a couple of the other group policy lessons that I have for you in this course so that it'll kind of bring this all together. All right, so in this utility here, I'll see my forest, globalmantics.local, and if I expand that, I can see my domains, sites, and then down here I have something called group policy modeling and group policy results. Now, we're not going to look at group policy modeling and results in this lesson, but they are a couple of very important tools, and we're going to look at them in another lesson where we talk about group policy processing, okay, when we see how these different settings are being processed. Okay, what I do have here is domains and sites, and the reason why is because, again, we'll learn this in more detail later, but group policy objects, okay, so the objects that have all these settings, can be linked to various containers, 2 of which are domains and sites. Now, beyond the domains, if I expand that, here I have my actual domain, you'll see that I also have other containers. Okay, I have my organizational units that we learned about in a previous lesson. And in that lesson, we talked about how organizational units are used to help with the implementation of group policy. And the reason why is because that's another container that group policy objects can be linked to. Now, if you're wondering what I mean by linking a group policy object to a container, what that means is taking the object of settings, and we'll look at this object and we'll see these settings in just a minute, but you need to understand this bigger picture concept first. If you take those settings and then link them to a container, those settings will now affect all of the users and or computers in that container. And that's what I mean by linking it to a container. So you'll notice, first of all, if we look at the globalmantics.local domain, that right underneath it here, there's already a default domain policy. Okay, that's one of 2 default policies that are created just by installing Active Directory. And the other one is the default domain controllers policy. And if you want to take a guess where that policy would be, yep, probably right here on the domain controllers container. Okay, the domain controllers organizational unit is where that's linked to. And I can see that by expanding that and seeing that I have the default domain controllers policy linked to that container. Now, if you jump down here to this container that says group policy objects, okay, I'm going to tell you that if I just click on it, that is where I can see all of my objects in the domain.
Now, I can either expand it, and I see them down here, or I could see it over here. Here's what I want to tell you. These are not links in the sense that group policy objects is not an actual container, right? It's not an actual organizational unit in Active Directory, right? If we jump over to Active Directory users and computers, we won't see a container that says group policy objects. This is a container specifically for the actual group policy objects themselves. Once they are created here, they then have to be linked out to either an organization unit, a domain, or again, we could also link down here to sites. And you'll notice everything's blank with sites because that's not something that we've created yet. We haven't created any sites in this environment. That's something for a whole different lesson altogether. Now, let's get into actually doing some of what I'm talking about. So first of all, if I were to put my cursor back here on group policy objects and I right click and say new, I could create a new demo GPO. Okay, so just to give it an example of a name. Now there's something here that says source starter GPO. You'll see that I don't have any to choose from, and we will address that in just a moment. There are these starter GPO templates that are available, and if we were to go ahead and make those starter templates available, we could start our settings off from those templates. But we'll get to that in just a minute. For right now, we're just going to say new demo GPO. It's not going to have any settings by default, okay, because we have no source to go from. It's just a GPO. If I click OK, sure enough, there's our new demo GPO. Now from there, if I were to take a container, so let's take our New York organizational unit. If I were to right click and say link an existing GPO, I could then link that new demo GPO. And what that means is now the new demo GPO is, any settings that are in that GPO are going to affect all users and or computers in the New York container. Now, you keep hearing me say it's going to affect all users and or computers. And the reason why is because we're going to see in just a moment when we go into edit one of these group policy objects that everything relates to users or computers. And certain group policy objects will have settings just for users and therefore will only affect users. Some GPOs will have settings for computers and will therefore only affect computers. Or we could have GPOs that have settings for both users and computers and therefore affect both. And that's why you hear me say affect all users and or computers. Now, another way that you could create a GPO, and I want you to think about the differences here. The one way we did it was we came down to the group policy objects container, created the GPO, but it wasn't actually affecting anybody yet. And there's nothing wrong with that. You may want to do that. You may want to create a group policy object, get it all set up with all the settings you want, and while you're doing that, have it not be affecting anybody. And then once it's done and it's ready to go, well, then we link it up to the container, and boom, it's actually in effect. But if we want to create a group policy object and have it immediately having an effect on certain users and or computers, you could take a container. So I'll take our New York sales container. You could right click and select create a GPO in this domain and link it here. So you can create and link all in one shot. So if I click on that, you see I get a very similar window. And I could say demo GPO already linked. Click OK. If I expand my NY sales container, you'll see I have that GPO, right? It's there and it's already linked. And you'll also notice that it appeared under the group policy objects. Demo GPO already linked. The only difference is now, as I update any settings on this GPO, it's already linked to a container, and therefore it's going to already affect those users and or computers. Now, as I promised, let's go in and see how to edit the settings on these GPOs. So if I select any one of these GPOs, okay, whether it be a default domain policy GPO, which, by the way, I don't necessarily recommend that you really mess with that default domain policy GPO. It's not that there are settings that you shouldn't be messing with as much as just understanding that you're truly affecting everybody in the domain, and That's still not necessarily a bad thing because there are group policy objects that you will create that'll be for everybody in the domain, but it's just better practice if you were to create group policy objects that were a little bit more specific to the task at hand. Okay, to go ahead and create a GPO that's supposed to serve a specific purpose. And let the default domain policy and the default domain controllers policy, let those just kind of sit there and do their thing and leave them alone. You don't have to. It's just good practice. But if I were to click on any one of these policies, and I'll click on the default domain policy just to show you. As soon as I click on it, I get this little message that comes up. It says you selected a link to a group policy object. Except for changes to the link properties, and that's something we'll actually learn about in another lesson altogether, changing the link properties. Any changes you actually make here to the group policy object itself are global to the GPO. And that means it'll impact other locations where the GPO is linked. What do you mean other locations where the GPO is linked? Well, I could take this demo GPO, right? This new demo GPO, and I've already have that linked to the New York container, right? Well, I could also come up here to, let's say, the domain controllers container, right click, say link an existing GPO. Here's that new demo GPO, and boom, look at that. I've now got it linked here. I've got it linked here. And that's what it means when you click on it and it says, hey, if you make any changes, it's changing the GPO as a whole, and it's going to affect everywhere that it's linked. Okay, I get that, and I understand that, so I'm going to say don't bother me with that message anymore. Okay, so just so we don't see that every time we click on a GPO from here on out. But if we do want to make changes to this GPO, well, let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to right-click on the GPO and select Edit. Now this takes us into the Group Policy Management Editor. And if I blow this up, as I mentioned before, everything has to do with affecting either computers, and that's why we have our computer configuration, or users, which is why we have our user configuration. If you are looking to have this group policy object make changes to computers, then you're going to be working with this top part, the computer configuration. If you're looking to have the settings in this group policy object affect users and make changes to those users, and this is the part that's a little confusing because it's like, are you really changing the user or the environment when the user logs in, which means really the computer? But it means based upon the user who's logged in, not based upon the computer they're logged on to. Then you do the user configuration. Now if we look under here, there's two different sections. We have policies and preferences. Now if we go back to Windows 2000 and the original Windows Server 2003, we only had policies. That's all we had. Now with Windows Server 2008 and with Windows Server 2012, we have preferences. Now as far as preferences, we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail here on these preferences. I mean, I can expand this down so you can see some of the different settings that you can affect with preferences. But the idea here is, these are group policy extensions that allow you to expand the range of configurable settings within a group policy object. And I'm trying to think of a really good way, because I understand what preferences are, and once you're working with them, you'll get what they are too. But it's hard to put a tangible definition onto it. One of the ways I first learned the difference between policies and preferences is, back in the old days, back when group policy was first created, back in Windows 2000, I would have somebody who would come up to me and say, hey, I have this scenario and I'm trying to do something and I want to know, can I accomplish this by using group policy? And my answer to them almost every single time would be, well, sure, of course you can. And the reason I could say with confidence that you could do it with group policy is because I knew that one of the policies, and we'll see this when we look at the policies, one of the policies in group policy objects is that you can run scripts. And so basically, I knew that my answer was, even if there wasn't a literal policy allowing this person to do what it was that they were trying to do, that they could write a script and then use group policy object to implement that script. Well, preferences helped to stop having to run scripts. Okay, the preferences allowed us to do things that we previously couldn't do with a standard policy, and we had to do a script. Now, again, I know that's not necessarily the perfect tangible to make you understand what preferences are, but that's kind of how I first looked at it when I was first learning about them. Now, let's look at policies, and maybe this will help you to understand what I was just talking about with the preferences. If I expand the policies here under user configuration, there's a lot of different settings. And the settings that I really want to focus on the most, let me move this over a little bit, are these administrative template policy definitions. There are more. I mean, there are software settings, okay, where we can manage software installation through group policy objects, although I will tell you, it's not done very often. There are some Windows settings, and hey, look at that. There's the scripts we were just talking about, right? You can do a log on or a log off script, or under the computer configuration, you'll notice under Windows settings, these scripts are startup and shutdown scripts, okay? Now let me kind of close this up so things don't get too confusing here. We have some security settings, okay, and this is where we get to see things like our public key policies and software restriction policies. Now, software restriction is something that is used with group policy objects in the sense that we will restrict the installation of certain software, whereas the actual software settings up here are for software deployment. Now, I will also tell you under security settings, what you see more often is not down here under users, but on the computer side, under the Windows settings, security settings, we get a lot more stuff here. And to be specific, we have things like our account policies, which include password policies and account lockout policies. And under local policies is where we see things like audit policy, which I talked about in another lesson, and user right assignment, so assigning rights to individual users. Now, are you getting confused yet? Well, if you're not, then that's good, but you're probably part of a minority. This is very confusing stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here. And that's why what I really want to do is not really focus on all this extra stuff that I'm whipping through very quickly, but go to these administrative templates. This is the stuff that you're going to use most often within your group policy objects. And if I jump into, let's just jump into control panel, just so that we can find an actual setting. Right? That's what you've been waiting for this whole time, is show me an actual setting. You're talking about all this group policy stuff. Show me the settings themselves. Okay, here they are. I'm going to give you an example here of one that says prohibit access to control panel and PC settings. And first of all, if I click on it, you'll see that you get an explanation here of what it does, including the requirements when it comes to what operating system, right? It needs at least Windows 2000, because some of these group policy object settings will only work if your client is at a high enough level. But if I double click on this here, it takes me into the actual setting itself, and you will see that it is set to not configured, and just about all of these settings have three choices: not configured, enabled, or disabled. Now, some of this is going to make more sense when you go into another lesson that we're going to go into, which talks about the actual processing of these group policy objects. We'll see why it means so much to be enabled versus disabled, or possibly even not configured. But here's the generic definition. Not configured means leave the setting alone. Okay, just don't touch the setting. Whatever it is that this setting is supposed to be doing, don't bother with it in this particular group policy object. Enabled means whatever it is that this setting is trying to do it. Like explicitly do it. Okay, so if this setting is to prohibit access to the control panel, by enabling it, you're explicitly prohibiting access to the control panel. If you disable, then you're explicitly saying, don't do this. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing, because some people think to themselves, well, if it's not configured, then I won't be prohibiting access to the control panel. And if I disable it, I'm not prohibiting access to the control panel, right? I mean, the difference is not configured is it's implied that we're not going to prohibit access to the control panel. Whereas disabling it means we are explicitly saying, you do not have access to the control panel. I am prohibiting you access to the control panel. Again, Very confusing stuff until this all comes together, and you have to watch all of the lessons for this to make sense. So this is something that we could set. I'm going to cancel out of here because we're not going to actually set anything here. I just wanted to show you that this is what the settings look like. Now, when it comes to these settings, and this is why people would come up to me all the time and say, hey, can you do this in group policy? Can you do that in group policy? The reason is because I don't think there's a single person on this planet that has memorized every last setting you can do with a group policy object. I mean, if I expand this stuff here, if I expand control panel, here's a whole bunch of settings. Here's a couple more. Here's a bunch more. Here's a bunch more. Some more. Oh, wait, I can expand that one. Here's another one. All of that we were just looking at, those were all just the control panel. And then we have desktop. We have all of these, plus we have those, plus we have those. And you see I could keep clicking all the way down through here, or I could even just click on all settings. And check this out. If I scroll through this, that's a lot of settings. And there are literally thousands of settings. And these settings, that's just for the user side. We have just as many if I expand the policies and go down to our administrative templates on the computer side. Okay, we have tons of them down here too. It's not expected that you're going to memorize all the group policy object settings that are available to you. I want you to understand the idea of, this is where you go to find this stuff. Okay, and I'm going to kind of close some of this up so it's not all cluttered like it was. You just have to kind of have the idea that, okay, I go into my group policy object editor, and then from there, do I want to work with computers? Do I want to be working with the users? And then you have to figure out if you're going to the policies or the preferences, and then you kind of got to get a general idea under the administrative templates, what area am I looking to affect? The good news is, remember, when you click on one, it will explain what it's doing. Okay? I mean, some of them are fairly obvious. Hide specified control panel items. Okay. Without even reading this whole big long explanation here, I know it's going to hide certain control panel items. I mean, I know that's the general idea of what it's going to do. All right, so let's go ahead and let's close out of here. And coming back here into the group policy management tool, down here we have this container that says starter GPOs. Right, I mentioned that before about the starter GPOs. And it says that the starter GPOs folder does not currently exist in this domain. Click on the button below to create this folder. So it's kind of weird, right? Because you're looking at it and you're like, well, it looks like it's there, but it says it's not. All right, let's go ahead and create it. So I will click that button, and it goes through and it creates it. And look at this. Look at how out of date these starter GPOs are. I mean, this is Windows Server 2012, and the starter GPOs that were created all have to do with Windows XP and Vista. What I can tell you is you can go out on the internet and you can get more up-to-date starter GPOs from Microsoft and then even third-party people who will create their own starter GPOs. And what these starter GPOs have to do with is, they'll have kind of the general idea of, hey, if you're going to implement a client and the client is going to be used for this certain type of worker, here are maybe some typical settings you might want to have on that type of a client. The reality is that you probably will have your own that you'll work with. Okay? I just want to show you that they do exist, but for the most part, I don't see this used too heavily. Now, the one last thing I want to show you before we wrap up this lesson, okay, because again, there's still, if you're thinking to yourself, what do you mean wrap up the lesson? I'm still completely confused on how this group policy stuff works. There's more lessons in this course. But for this lesson right here, the one last thing I want to show you has to do with the deleting of a link and or the deleting of a GPO. So let me go ahead and expand group policy objects so you can see all my group policy objects down here. I'll expand some of these other containers so that you can see where those GPOs are linked. I want to show you that if I take this new demo GPO, and it's linked, right? This is the link of that GPO to the domain controller's container. If I right-click and I select delete, it says, do you want to delete this link? This will not delete the GPO itself. And if I click OK, watch what happens. Demo GPO is no longer under the domain controllers, but it still exists under group policy objects right here, and it's still under the New York container. If I want to delete the actual GPO itself, okay, get rid of the settings, then you come down here to the group policy objects container, and now I right-click, select delete. Watch what happens. Do you want to delete this GPO and all links to it in this domain? Keep in mind, it's not going to delete links in other domains. If you happen to have created this GPO and then linked it to containers in other domains, well, the GPO itself will still exist in the GPO's container in those other domains, and you won't affect them. Okay, so that's why it says it won't affect other domains. But in this domain, if I click yes, we should see it disappear from here and up here under New York. So I'm going to click yes, and sure enough, it disappeared in both places. So that's pretty much the high-level overview of how to create your GPOs and manage your GPOs, and that includes editing your GPOs.
And so that does bring us to the end of this first lesson, but please keep in mind that this right here is just giving you some of the fundamentals, really, of working with group policy objects. Please make sure that you follow this up by watching the group policy infrastructure or implementing a group policy infrastructure lesson to see how this will all start to work in your Windows Server 2012 environment. So I'll see you in that next lesson.